What Hath Darwin to Do with Scripture is my favorite book on evolution in the Bible that I have read. Let me tell you what I mean. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Okay, I just finished a copy of the newly released book from Dru Johnson and IVP, What Hath Darwin to Do with Scripture? Thank you to IVP for sending me this copy. This is my honest response to the book. This is going to be a very positive review, just letting you know at the front. I love this book, but I'm going to unpack a little bit about why I loved it so much through my typical format of the main idea, the research behind the book, the readability of it, and then my reaction overall. So let's dig in. The main idea of What Hath Darwin to Do with Scripture is this is contending to be a book about evolution and Scripture, but it's contending to be a wholly different approach than how most publishing gets at this topic. By that, I mean this is not a book that's trying to reconcile empirical science about the age of the Earth or genetics, the genome of species, with the historical account presented in the Scriptures. It's not trying to do any of that. It does not wade into any of those debates at all. There's nothing about the back and forth between creationists and old Earth or theistic evolutionists. There's nothing like that. What this book is trying to do, and why I loved it so much, this is why I loved it so much, is because it's trying to get underneath those, frankly, surface level conversations, and it's trying to get into what are the philosophical underpinnings of an evolutionary view of the world and history and humanity. What are the philosophical underpinnings of that view? And then what are the philosophical underpinnings of kind of the big picture of the scriptural view of the world and humanity and our history? What are the philosophical things under the surface of both of those kind of lenses? And do they or don't they overlap? Is there any point of resonance and overlap and kind of sympathies between those two philosophical presuppositions, or where do they part? Where might they be different? So it's really trying to get to sidestep the common areas of debate and disagreement between evolution and Scripture, and get kind of under to the meatier, deeper, more interesting stuff. Well, more interesting in my view. So I knew that this was the goal of the book, and I'm familiar with Dru Johnson's work through especially podcasts like On Script and some of his previous writings, and so I was really intrigued, and that's why I was interested in this book. And I have to say, it did not disappoint me at all. So, but let me get a few more specifics about the main idea before I get more into some of the other areas of my review. So more specifically, the philosophical underpinnings of each kind of lens that Dru Johnson takes on are. There's three. The first is the notion of scarcity of resources. How does evolution kind of incorporate this notion of how does scarcity of resources drive the evolutionary kind of account? And also, how might that be portrayed in the scriptural account? The second one is the notion of fit, or like fitness to the environment. You might hear the phrase survival of the fittest. Well, fit meaning like how well a species fits into its surroundings, its container, its environment. How is that talked about in the evolutionary frame, and how is that talked about in Scripture, or is it talked about in Scripture? And then third is sex, or generation and propagation, like offspring and perpetuating kind of your genealogy or your generations of your family, so on. How does that talked about and framed in evolution and also in Scripture? Those are the three. That's really how the book is structured, around those three kind of subcategories, those three areas of thought. Again, he doesn't get into age of the Earth, doesn't get into even really much empirical science. It's really about philosophy. So that's what it's about. He takes each of those, how it applies to Scripture, how it applies to evolution. Is there any agreement, point of overlap, point of dissonance, point of disagreement? That's what Hath Darwin to Do with Scripture is all about. Okay, so the research. So Dru Johnson is primarily a biblical theology, biblical studies scholar. So there's a lot, and he's a prolific scholar. He's written a lot in academic work. So he's done his like more than his due diligence to write a book like this when it goes to the Scripture side. Notably, his big work, which I haven't read, is called Biblical Philosophy, in which he does more of a fully focused presentation on the biblical side of this argument. But all that to say, he's done a lot of work on the biblical side, so I was really interested to see what he would bring in on the kind of so-called science or evolutionary or Darwin side. And I got to say, I was really impressed. He quotes primary sources as it relates to Darwin pretty thoroughly. He represents them fairly. He quotes primary, not just secondary texts. He also engages with the work of someone else. I appreciate Josh Swamidass, whose Genealogical Adam and Eve is a really interesting book. He engages with that work quite a bit. But he brings in, again, and he doesn't get weighed down by the empirical scientific debates about, again, like age of rocks, age of the earth, geological stuff. He doesn't get weighed down by that, so he sidesteps all of that and gets right into the philosophy, but he does bring in writings under the Darwinian evolutionary frame, and he represents them fairly and quotes them directly, and I think does an extremely thoughtful job of interacting with those sources. So that's a bit about the research. It's very good. Now, the readability of it, I found this book genuinely enjoyable to read, but I don't know that would be the case for everybody. It does err on a more academic, philosophical style of writing. It's not very long, which really helps, and it's organized well under those three kind of sub-themes. But I could see someone... So first of all, if you're looking for more of the well-trod debates around this issue, you're not going to find it there. That might be frustrating if you're looking for kind of a rhetorical hammer pro or against one of these sides, that as the way it's framed, it's not in here. But I found the book, I found it really interesting because I was primed to be intrigued by this deeper argument he's trying to make. This like under the surface, what's the philosophy at work? What are the presuppositions at work as it relates to an evolutionary frame of human history? I was primed for that, so I was like super immersed in this book, and I found it genuinely enthralling, and I was like really excited to keep reading. And one other piece I want to note on the readability is that something I love about Dru Johnson's work and kind of the community he represents in general, the more biblical theology, biblical philosophy movement, is he takes a more serious philosophical literary lens on the scriptures he talks about. And so he works through, like when he's talking about scarcity of resources, and he draws out that theme in some Old Testament texts. It is so interesting to relook at familiar stories, but through the lens of scarcity of resources, and how might the biblical story be presenting that as something that's driving the narrative forward. Similarly with the theme of sex and producing offspring, looking at the story of Lot, for example, and seeing that at play behind the scenes, so to speak, and that story kind of operating as like a philosophical kind of idea that's driving things forward. So fascinating. So if you're already familiar with scripture, but you haven't looked at it through these lenses before, I think that his reading is going to really be illuminating and quite, it was energizing for me. So, and I found it accessible, I found it comprehensible, and again, the book is not very long, which also really helps the readability factor. So take that for what it's worth. It does lean, he's an academic, he engages with academic sources, he's doing primary quotations of On the Origin of Species and more. So if that stuff is just dry to you, not of interest to you, factor that in to this point. But I found it very readable and very engaging, very interesting. And then, okay, finally, last section here is my reaction to this book. I've already tipped my hand. I love this book. I just loved this book, mostly because of how refreshingly different it is in this debate that just seems to be so cyclical and kind of interminable. A lot of people are just retreading old arguments. I mentioned Josh Swamidass. I found his book to be another exception where he kind of brings in a refreshing, different approach to this whole debate in terms of the science of genealogy and taking the biblical text seriously. So it was a refreshing, but not surprising to me that this book is in conversation with Swamidass's work, because Swamidass is I think charging forward in a new way to get at this. So I think that Dru Johnson is right there with him now. He's trying to break open the old ruts and patterns we're in when we're trying to figure out this debate, so to speak. So I just loved it for those reasons, primarily that he's trying to do something new and different, and he's just very solidly sidestepping all of the tried and true, I would say, overly rehearsed points that go back and forth in the whole evolution versus scripture conversation. So I just love the framing of the book. I love the approach. I love the posture he took. I also love the confident engagement with Darwin's actual work, and also the Darwinian work after him, the way his interaction, his fair interaction with people who are evolutionary thinkers. And I just found, at the end of the day, I found this to be a so much of a more illuminating and productive way to think about the tensions between an evolutionary look at the world and history and the scriptural look at the world and history. This is just way more productive, in my view, than revisiting all those old debates that we keep having about timelines and dates and how to measure the age of rocks and whatnot. So for all of those reasons, I found this to be just a wonderful book, a wonderful kind of inclusion in this ongoing kind of publication, debate and conversation about these worldviews and these historical accounts. And I think that I think what he's modeling in this book is a much better way to move forward. Like the posture he takes and the way that he approaches the conversation is the way that I, as a pastor, want to approach these conversations. I want to look at what are the operative views, presuppositions, worldviews, whatever term you want to use. What are the operative things under the surface that are actually kind of the containers that drive how we then think? And how do we more fruitfully compare those for and against kind of what the scriptural account is. And so I just found it very clarifying. I found it a winsome book. I found it genuinely insightful with the biblical text and the exegetical work he does. And it just like got my brain really going. If anything, I'd like to see more. I'd like to see like a longer entry. I'm probably going to go back to his biblical philosophy text after this because I'm so intrigued by kind of the ways that he approaches the text. But all that to say, What Hath Darwin to Do with Scripture is a fantastic, fantastic book. If you're in this conversation, if you're interested in this debate, this is a no-brainer. Grab a copy, sit down with it, and then let it kind of stretch your thinking and put you into kind of a new direction as it relates to this whole conversation about Darwin, evolution, human history, and what the Bible is trying to teach us. So, thank you, Dru Johnson. Thank you to IVP for publishing this wonderful, wonderful work. And thank you to you for taking some time to watch.